Good afternoon. It's nice to see a few of you here in the building, and also welcome to anybody who's watching online. My name is Naomi Tuma and I am the curate here at St Peter Mancroft. This afternoon's reflection will be looking at racism in the Church of England. We are in the middle of Black History Month here in Norwich and around the UK. A month where we're encouraged to celebrate the contribution made by Black people throughout the history of the UK, and to re-evaluate the way in which we understand our history, particularly our history of slavery and empire. The recent Black Lives Matter campaign has brought much needed attention to the problem of racism in the United States and the United Kingdom. And a new understanding of racism has been popularised by books such as Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race and White Fragility, which I have here. So, hang on, wrong one. These books, this is Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, and this is White Fragility. And they bring to the public a conception of racism which are about racism not being about good and bad people, but racism being a structural construct. We know that none of us wants to be labelled a racist, and so if somebody suggests that we might be a bit racist, we get very defensive. But the point that these books make is that racism is a cultural problem rather than an individual problem, or as well as an individual problem. Eddo-Lodge in this book says, this isn't about good and bad people. Structural racism is dozens or hundreds or thousands of people with the same biases joining together to make one organisation and act accordingly. Structural is often the only way to capture what goes unnoticed. The silently raised eyebrow, the implicit bias, the snap judgment made on perceptions of competency. It's not about personal prejudice, but about the collective effects of bias. And these two books, White Fragility and Why I'm No Longer Talking About Race to White People, give a kind of broad brush look at structural racism within the UK and the US. But I'd also like to look at another two books today which talk specifically about racism and the Church of England. One of my favourite books that I've read this year is God is Not a White Man and Other Revelations. Now, you may think that saying God is not a white man is stating the obvious. But actually, culturally, we have a lot of things in our churches which suggest that God is in fact a white man and that Jesus was a white man. And this is written by Chine MacDonald, who actually spoke here at St Peter Mancroft last year when we had our Gaia exhibition. And the point that Chine makes is that because the idea of made in the image of God is inherent in our faith and the way that we think about people, we think of people as being made in the image of God, then it's really important to recognise what our image of God is. And if our image of God is even subconsciously the image of a white male, then somehow that leads us to believe that people who are neither white nor male are somehow slightly less good than those people who are white and male. Somehow, they're a little bit closer to God, a little bit more able, a little bit more respectable, a little bit cleverer, more holy, more trustworthy, just generally better than people who are neither white nor male. And a lot of this thinking is subconscious. We don't consciously think about it, but it's there in our culture. Chine MacDonald says that the aim of her book is to tell stories of the real life and far-reaching effects of a world that has presented God as white and male. And she's really interesting in that she talks about how the image of God in man is not just about intellect or curiosity or thought, but it's actually about the flesh and blood of human bodies. She repeatedly asserts that physical features of black women, our curves, our hair, our successes, our failures, express the image of God in humanity. This would not really be necessary to assert, except for Western beauty myths that equate pale skin and hair with beauty and with holiness, and dark skin with evil and the devil. And you may not think that this is something we see, but actually I recently read a popular book on icons. I've got an interest in Russian icons. And this book, which was only published in 2010, so a modern contemporary book, had a description which read, "Mary has the most delicate of complexions, rose petal and otherworldly. She glimmers before us with luminous beauty, an imitation of the truth of heaven." And it is this unthinking correlation between white Western beauty ideals and holiness that demands the articulation of a theology that overtly states that black people are beautiful and are made in God's image, just as white people are, and just as all people from all ethnicities are. This reflects the Black Lives Matter campaign, where it wouldn't really be necessary to state that Black Lives Matter, except that sometimes the way our culture works looks like they don't matter. So of course, white lives also matter, but that doesn't seem to need to be stated in the same way. The physical reality of our bodies and the way in which they're honoured or abused is directly related in the way in which those bodies are seen as being made in the image of God. When God is seen as white and male, then bodies which are neither white nor male will be treated with less respect. And I challenge you and all churchgoers to have a look around at their churches and in the images they see, and to see how God and Jesus and other significant biblical figures or saintly figures are presented. And yes, it is appropriate to present Jesus in a locally relevant way. But it's not okay to exclusively represent Jesus as white, and it's not really okay to export this image abroad. And very few of our contexts are exclusively white or male, as the art in our churches is. So I would really recommend that you read God is Not a White Man. It's a very easy read, and it's a very lovely book. The second book I'd like to look at is this book, and it is by a chap called A.D.A. Franz Williams. It's called Ghost Ship. And whilst Chine MacDonald's book was a broad brush look at the effects of structural racism in the church and in the UK, Franz Williams narrows down the beam of his examination onto the Church of England. And he's not a fan of the Church of England in the way that it has handled racism. He suggests that it may not even be healthy or possible for black or United Kingdom minority ethnic people to continue to participate in the life of the Church of England, because the Church of England, as far as he's concerned, hasn't addressed its legacy of colonialism and racism. He examines the Church's culpability for supporting and defending the slave trade and other colonising activities. And he argues that the legacy of these historical sins continues to affect attitudes within the Church, and will do so until the Church publicly and wholeheartedly repents of them. One of his most telling arguments is to ask the question about the way the Church is fully involved in Remembrance Sunday and in marking lives lost in war, which he doesn't suggest is a bad thing. But he does raise the question of why similar levels of remembrance and expression of grief aren't given to remembering the millions of people enslaved and traded through British companies, territories, and institutions during the years of colony and slave trade. He also looks much more recently at the Church of England and looks at ways in which the institution has worked against giving black clergy and black members of the church appropriate expression and voice. Not everyone agrees with his analysis of the church, but it is worth reading. And it is worth noting that actually the statistics of the numbers of United Kingdom minority ethnic clergy in the church is disproportionately low. So you might ask, well, what is the church doing about this? And actually, this book, Ghost Ship, was written before the publication of a new report called From Lament to Action. This report was published recently and is challenging reading, but it does set out a roadmap for how the church might address its historical and cultural racism. And thankfully, this report and its recommendations are being taken seriously by both local and national churches. It's clear that the Church of England, like many institutions in the UK, is structurally and culturally biased against people of colour. But we are taking steps to change this culture. And one of the first steps is to recognise that there is a problem. And these books help us to understand what the problem is. Jesus tells a parable about not trying to pick a piece of dust out of our friend's eye before we notice the log in our own eye. And these books very much help us to see the log in our own eye. So what can we do? Well, the first thing that I would suggest is that we can read any or all of these books. White Fragility, God is Not a Ghost Man, Ghost Ship, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. All of them will give you an insight into the problems of racism within the UK and the Church of England, but they also help us to understand how to not be defensive, how to not feel insulted when somebody might suggest that there might be racism within our culture. Read them in the knowledge that we are all part of fallen humanity and that very few people are deliberately racist. But we are all part of a society that historically and culturally is biased towards white men. Read them with open eyes and open hearts, and hopefully we will all be able to see better. Thank you.